Hello, I hope this video finds you well. This is to support a student who is running into some problems with the development of his IA, and it specifically has to do with accessing data from his Firebase real-time database and showing it on a modal. So essentially, the student has a Firebase database, something like this. This is just one I made up. So we have some collection called products, and we see we have a name and a quantity for each one, and some randomized key. And what we want to happen is that when we hit the modal, I want to see the product, and then I put the quantity here. Now, what was happening with the student was the following. Was essentially they were running the modal and they were getting a bunch of undefined. And so in this video, I'm first going to show, what the problem was, what the student was doing, and to understand that underlying idea, and then talk about how we can go about fixing that. There's no need to really understand Firebase, but I'm going to do a quick little, I'm going to refer to Firebase, and I'm going to talk a little bit how to build a modal and a couple ideas around modal development. Okay, so let's start by looking at this problem version first, which is IndexedDB problem. And you can find a link to all the code in the comment section. So we produce our modal right here, and the modal has this ID called product display. And so what happens is here is where I connect to my database, I initialize it, I access to the database functions by connecting it to the Firebase there. I get the element by display product display, and I set data to an empty value. So for now, I just put the string empty in there because I just wanted to. And then I come down here, and this is where I actually go and update data based on the database collection products. Okay, so what we do, and this is what a lot of students are doing at this stage, is they're essentially creating some local variable, and they're copying the data into that local variable, which they can use. Which is, not perfect, but it's fine for the stage we're at, and it actually highlights a lot of good ideas. So down here, what you'll see is this is the initialization for the modal, and then here, what I do is I update the page, update the modal content. And so what I do is I say, okay, I set the product displayed under HTML to nothing. I just log the data for now to see what it is. And then I loop through for key and data, and then I kind of update the product by saying data at key at name and data at key at quantity. Because the thinking often here is that, well, I've gone and copied the data in at this point, so therefore when I'm down here, I can loop through it. And that's where we have a problem. And so if I come back to my web page and I run it, and I see that I've printed out empty. And the reason I've printed out empty is because right here, where I console.log it, I haven't actually successfully updated the data yet. And that is because this call takes time. So JavaScript will run line by line code, line by line, but when it runs into what's called an asynchronous call, it will go and run off and send a request to do that, and then it takes time for that to happen. So what happens here is it has to actually save the database, send me the information for everything under products ref, but it continues to run the code, and that's why down here we update with the wrong information. So how do we solve that problem? Well, one way to go about this is to actually take our modal that we created, and we're going to run a callback function, and that callback function actually runs when the modal gets initiated. So I'm going to start off by looking at this first index.html that has no database stuff. It's just simply a modal. So what I've done is I'm just going to pause and pull up the materialize modal section. So what I have here is this. I've essentially just taken the code directly from the modal section. And so you need this code, and then down here you have the initialization. And I've chosen to initialize it with the materialize initialization code. And where students often make a mistake here is they don't realize they have to actually initialize this variable options. We see here that we have elms, which is defined by query selecting all the modals on the page. But then what I need to do is I actually need to initialize this variable options, because I can pass a bunch of options into the modal. And the option I'm interested in particular is called open on start, which takes a function. So what I can do is I can actually associate an option with the modal so that it runs a function when the modal starts. So let's take a look at how we do that. So here's my code for my modal. That's the button. This is the modal itself. Here's the script to the JavaScript for materialize. And then essentially, I've done this in 3 different ways. So when people first start this, what they do often is we see our document add event listener, DOM content loaded, and then we have this callback function here. And what's, like I said, students often forget to do is they forget to do this. So they have this set up and then they run it, but the problem is options hasn't been defined. So if I come back into here and I refresh this page, make sure this is the right one, yep, and I hit modal, you'll see here that I'll get an error because options is not defined. And so what I do is the first thing we do is we kind of come in here and we just say options equals, and we just basically put an empty object there. So now when I come here and I run this, oh, pardon me, go back to here, that. And now when I come back and I give this a run, if I refresh this and hit go, oh, pardon me, what's going on here? I was all sorts of places there. I wasn't actually reading what happened. I'd forgotten the S. So I have options, and currently this modal has no options associated with it, or really all the modals on the page, because this does it for all of the modals on the page. So I set options to nothing. But what I want to do actually, you go back to what I had there, is I want to take options and I'm going to send the option on open start, and I'm going to pass that module load, which is a function I've written up here. So module load, and essentially, so what this does is as soon as our module starts to load, it executes this function. So if I save this now and I run this, watch down here when I hit modal, see how it's loading? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually take this code here and I'm going to write inside this function, I'm going to actually access the data from the database and then use that to update the modal. Now, just as a little side point here, I've done this a couple different ways because when I started teaching this stuff, I'd never teach arrow functions because, you know, it's just added notation, but the reality is you're going to come across them. So we have three different types of notation here. We have kind of this, we had the first one where you actually write the function manually and then we just pass the function name as a parameter. You could also write this using this type of notation where I actually don't have a function name, but I just put the function right into the actual object that I'm passing. And that would work perfectly fine. There it goes. And that's the standard notation. And then the third way we could do that is we could actually do this with an arrow function, which, you know, a lot of stuff we come across is arrow functions where I just write the function using arrow function there. Doesn't matter which format you use, they all work the same. Okay, so then what do we do here? Well, what I actually do now is if I come into this index.db is, again, I just use this notation where I wrote the function manually, had the same setup. And so inside here, I do a console.log loading, and then I go out and I grab my reference to products. I do a one-time access and I access on the value, and then I use the .then, because remember, this generates a promise to do something. It's an asynchronous process. So I have to say, once I get that product stuff sent back to me, then what I want you to do is to execute this code. What does this code do? It takes snapshot.val, which essentially takes the callback function's parameter, which is the information, and then that actually goes and copies it into data. I clear the product.display inner HTML, and then I use this for each loop where I loop through each key in data, and I print it out so you can see it. We don't need that. Now let's leave it. And then I just basically append to the product display using product display.inner HTML and access the appropriate information. So if we come back into here and we run this, and I hit modal, there it is. So this was a very fast kind of explanation to help answer a question. If you're someone that's just kind of found your way here, please don't hesitate to ask questions. And as always, please let me know if you have need any support. Have a great day.